For most of the 20th century, the Neanderthal was the perfect villain in the story of human evolution, the cautionary tale, the dead end, the species that our ancestors encountered, competed with, and ultimately left behind. They were depicted as hunched and brutish, their foreheads sloping, their faces projecting, their intellect presumed to be something less than fully human. Museum dioramas showed them crouching in caves, while Homo sapiens stood upright in the sunlight beyond. The message was clear, if never explicitly stated. We were the winners, they were the losers, and the distance between them and us was the distance between the primitive and the modern. In 2010, that story was demolished. Not revised, not complicated, demolished. Svante Pääbo and his team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published the first draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome, assembled from bone fragments recovered at multiple European sites. The sequencing itself was a technical achievement so extraordinary that it would eventually earn Pääbo the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2022. But the finding embedded in that sequence was more extraordinary than the method used to recover it. When the Neanderthal genome was compared to the genomes of living humans from different parts of the world, the results showed that people of European and Asian ancestry carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, not as a statistical artifact, not as a methodological error, as a genuine signal of interbreeding between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals sometime in the past, most likely in the Middle East, where the two species would have encountered each other during the early dispersal of modern humans out of Africa. The Neanderthals did not simply disappear when modern humans arrived. Some of them had children with us, and those children's descendants are walking around today. This single finding changed everything. To understand what the Neanderthal genome revealed, you first need to understand what the Neanderthals actually were. Not the museum diorama version, the real version. Neanderthals were not a primitive precursor to modern humans. They were a separate species, or by some classifications a subspecies, of the genus Homo, with their own evolutionary history that had been unfolding in Europe and Western Asia for at least 200,000 years before modern humans arrived on the scene. They were large-brained. The Neanderthal brain was, on average, comparable in size to, or even slightly larger than the modern human brain. They made tools, using a sophisticated technique called the Mousterian tradition, which required planning, standardization, and the transmission of knowledge across generations. They buried their dead, in some cases with apparent ritual, with flowers placed in the grave at sites like Shanidar Cave in Iraq. They made ochre pigment. They made personal ornaments from eagle talons and shells. There is evidence, contested but persistent, that they made music. They were not brutes, they were people, different from us, shaped by a different evolutionary trajectory across a different geography, but recognizably, fully, members of the genus that thinks, and makes, and buries its dead, and decorates itself. The museum diorama version was always a projection of our own need to feel superior to something, not an accurate representation of who the Neanderthals were. And now the genome confirmed what the archaeology had been suggesting for decades. The Neanderthals were not simply our predecessors in a march of progress. They were our relatives, our cousins in evolutionary terms. And for a period of time, somewhere in the ancient Middle East or perhaps in multiple locations across the zone where the two species met, they were something more intimate than that. The genomic analysis has, in the years since the 2010 paper, been refined with extraordinary precision. The 1 to 4% figure has held up and been elaborated. The Neanderthal contribution to the modern human genome is not uniform across all populations. People of sub-Saharan African ancestry carry essentially no Neanderthal DNA, which is consistent with the interbreeding having occurred outside Africa, after the out-of-Africa migration but before the dispersal of modern humans into East Asia, Europe, and the Pacific. People of East Asian ancestry carry, on average, slightly more Neanderthal ancestry than people of European ancestry, a pattern that researchers have explained through a combination of additional interbreeding events in the Eastern Expansion Corridor and differences in subsequent natural selection. But the most significant developments in the post-2010 research have not been about the quantity of Neanderthal ancestry in modern humans. They have been about what that ancestry does. What function, if any, does the Neanderthal DNA that we carry actually serve in the modern human body? The answers that have emerged from research teams across Europe, North America, and Asia over the following decade are simultaneously fascinating and sobering. The Neanderthal contribution to the modern human genome is not randomly distributed. It is concentrated in certain regions of the genome and absent in others, a pattern that suggests natural selection has been operating on Neanderthal-derived sequences since they entered the human gene pool, keeping some and eliminating others. The regions where Neanderthal ancestry is most depleted tend to be regions related to brain development and male fertility. The regions where it is retained tend to be related to immune function, skin biology, and metabolism. This pattern tells a story. When modern humans and Neanderthals interbred, some of the resulting hybrids were more fit and some were less fit. The sequences that reduced fitness, particularly those affecting male fertility and certain aspects of neural development, were gradually eliminated from the population over subsequent generations. The sequences that enhanced fitness, particularly those that gave the incoming modern human population access to immune defenses that Neanderthals had developed across 200,000 years of adaptation to the European and Asian environment, were retained and spread. The Neanderthal DNA in modern humans is, in this sense, a gift. Or at least a portion of it is. When anatomically modern humans moved into Europe and Asia, they were entering environments that were teeming with pathogens they had never encountered. The Neanderthals had been there for 200,000 years, had survived those pathogens, and had evolved immune responses adapted to them. By interbreeding with Neanderthals, modern humans acquired, through the most direct biological mechanism imaginable, a partial copy of that hard-won immune knowledge. Specific Neanderthal-derived variants in modern human genomes have been linked to immune functions, to responses to viral infection, to skin barrier function. The TLR1, TLR6, and TLR10 genes, which encode proteins involved in recognizing bacterial pathogens, carry Neanderthal-derived variants in modern humans that appear to have been positively selected, meaning they enhance survival. The EPAS1 gene variant found in Tibetan populations that enables high-altitude adaptation was later found not to be Neanderthal-derived, but Denisovan-derived, a finding that opened an entirely separate conversation, but the general pattern it illustrates, of archaic human variants providing modern humans with adaptive tools for new environments, is consistent with what the Neanderthal data shows. There is another dimension to the Neanderthal story that the genomics has illuminated, one that concerns not what happened when modern humans met Neanderthals, but what happened to the Neanderthals afterward. Because the interbreeding, however real, was apparently limited. The Neanderthal contribution to modern human genomes is 1 to 4%. The modern human population exploded in size and range. The Neanderthal population dwindled and disappeared. Why? The ancient DNA from Neanderthal sites gives a partial answer. The Neanderthal populations of Europe were, in the period immediately before their disappearance, showing signs of severe inbreeding and reduced genetic diversity. Late Neanderthal individuals, recovered from sites in Spain and Russia, dated to within the last 50,000 years of Neanderthal existence, showed genome-wide patterns consistent with small, isolated, reproductively stressed populations. They were already in trouble before modern humans arrived. The modern human expansion may not have been a conquest. It may have been the final pressure on a population that was already declining, already fragmented, already losing the demographic battle against its own small numbers. There were also likely disease. The modern humans who left Africa carried pathogens to which Neanderthals had no immunity. The exchange of immune genes went both ways, but the disease load accompanying modern human expansion into Neanderthal territory was probably devastating for populations that had never been exposed to the specific viral and bacterial repertoire of Africa. This is speculative, because pathogens leave no fossil record, but the analogy with historical contact between previously isolated human populations, where the incoming group's diseases devastated the existing population regardless of any other factor, makes the hypothesis more than plausible. The Neanderthals did not lose a war. They were diminished by a combination of their own small numbers, their own inbreeding, and the biological consequences of encounter with a larger, more genetically diverse population that carried pathogens against which their immune systems had no defense. And before they disappeared entirely, A small number of them passed their genes into the lineage that survived. That is not a defeat. That is a kind of persistence. Here is what changes when you understand the Neanderthals, not as the losers of evolution, but as the carriers of something that survived them. The 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA in the genome of a person of European or Asian ancestry is not a trace of something lesser. It is a trace of adaptation. It is the biological residue of 200,000 years of survival in some of the most demanding environments that early humans faced. It is, in the parts that natural selection kept, a tool that the modern human lineage acquired not by defeating the Neanderthals, but by joining with them. Svante Pääbo, in his memoir about the Neanderthal Genome Project, describes the moment when the analysis first showed the interbreeding signal. He had expected to find that the Neanderthal genome was entirely separate from the modern human genome, confirming the story of clean replacement. What he found instead was the signal of connection, of interbreeding, of the messy reality that human evolution had never been as linear or as separable as the textbooks described. The Neanderthals were never the villains. They were never the losers. They were never the brutes crouching in a cave while we stood in the sunlight. They were a people, with their own long history, their own adaptations, their own forms of intelligence and culture and social life, who encountered another people and, in the ordinary human way of peoples encountering each other, sometimes had children together. Those children carried something forward, and what they carried forward is in us, right now, doing work that we are only beginning to understand. The history of humanity has never been a single unbroken line from primitive to modern. It has always been a braided stream, with tributaries flowing in from unexpected directions, carrying genetic and cultural material from people we thought were entirely separate from us, and who turn out, when the genome is read carefully, to be woven into us more deeply than we knew. The story that the 20th century told about human evolution was a story that needed a villain to make the hero legible. The Neanderthal served that function. The crouching brute in the cave, against whom modern humans defined themselves as upright, as intelligent, as victorious. That story was never about the Neanderthals. It was always about us and our need to see our own emergence as inevitable, as clean, as the result of superiority rather than the result of encounter, mixture, luck, and the ordinary biological messiness of two populations that shared a planet for tens of thousands of years and could not entirely resist each other. What the genome tells us is that the resistance was, in fact, partial, that the separation was never absolute, that the human story is not the story of one kind of mind replacing another, but of multiple kinds of mind meeting, mixing, and producing something that carried pieces of each into a future neither of them could have predicted. The Neanderthals were never what we thought, because what we thought was a story about winners and losers, about progress and obsolescence, about us and them. What the DNA says is something simpler and more true. There was no them. There was only a larger, more complicated, more entangled us.